Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our second webinar organized by the RES4Africa Foundation to define and discuss the strategy of the post-COVID consequence on the African continent in terms of energy. In the previous webinar, we underlined the impact of COVID-19 on the African energy industry, and we believe that the renewable-based solution can be a pivotal contribution to the African recovery to improve the quality of life of a million people, even long after this pandemic. We must rethink, in our opinion, the global system and accelerate toward an economy more sustainable and more attentive and more resilient. Placing renewable energy at the heart of COVID recovery measure is crucial to bridge the energy gap that Africa suffers. And with the right policy framework in place, investment in renewable will bring much needed jobs, gross domestic product growth, and welfare gains. Now, the second webinar that I am about to start is an interesting one because it's called Connecting the Dots, Why Only 2% of global renewable in Africa? Mr. Kamiseka will explain later why we started with this one, but definitely what happened in the last 10 years, what could have happened, what were the gaps, what happened elsewhere, and what's next now. So I think we are very proud to present to you a full study that you can download already from your website. And to accompany us, as usual in these three webinars, is our friend and media personality, Joy Dorembira, who is the voice of RES4Africa, to whom, Joy, I pass the floor to guide this webinar. Thank you, Joy, and have a great day with us. See you later.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Roberto Bigotti. Greetings, everyone. As you've heard, my name is Joy. By now, I'm sure I'm a familiar face with RES4Africa's webinars. And it's great to have you on here as well from across the world, wherever it is you're joining in from. So today we're focusing on why there's been only 2% addition of renewable energy across Africa. Where are the gaps? And of course, focusing on the best practices and what exactly happened in the last 10 years, what limited renewable energy growth, and also what are some of the action points that we can take right now to boost the addition of renewable energy across Africa. Of course, we have seen major success stories like Morocco, and we're going to be having someone who's going to speak about that to give us the story of Morocco, and that is Jean-Peter, who is going to talk about the wind energy success story of Morocco. And then we will have, of course, in fact, before him, we're going to have Luca Traini, who is going to be talking to us about what happened in the last 10 years. And that will set the pace for the success story by Jean-Peter, who is from Morocco. And he is the managing director of Morocco at Siemens Gesema. And he's going to talk to us about the success story there. Then we'll get into what exactly limited the renewable energy growth. And Mathieu Ledepont, who is the competitor intelligence market studies and strategic analysis specialist at Enel Green Power, will be coming in to give us that bit. Then we'll have Silva Piana, who is the head of regulatory affairs, Africa, Asia, and the Oceania at Enel Green Power as well, who will now come and talk to us about the best practices. Then from that point on, we will have the action programs, which is a South African success story, which is going to be presented by Amit Singh, who is the co-head energy finance at Nedbank, which is a South African-based bank, but is growing across the continent, and also is the first partner based in Africa of RES4Africa Foundation. So that is great news. And then we will have the webinar, of course, closed by Roberto Bigotti, who is the Secretary General of RES4Africa Foundation. So to start us off, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Engineer Antonio Kamiseka, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Enel Green Power, who is also the head of Enel Global Power Generation and the President at RES4Africa Foundation. Welcome, Engineer Antonio.
Thank you very much, Joy, and welcome to the second RES4Africa webinar also from my side. Of course, the format of the webinar is mandatory in this very difficult moment where pandemic is still deploying its negative effects all around the world. And so we don't want to stop talking and acting for the main, let's say, goal of the foundation, which is to try to promote a faster, safer, more reliable access to electricity in Africa. And so we believe that maintaining the contacts even through digital media, it's an opportunity, and probably it's an opportunity that we have discovered that come very at handy when it's about to organize meetings like these, where sometimes people have no time to move and travel to Africa or to Europe or anywhere else. And just with the convenience of being in contact through digital media, we can reconvene all together for an hour, discuss, and then go back to our daily routine. So I hope we can interact in the same way we would have been doing in a lobby, in a conference room, or in a hotel. Not with the same pleasure, maybe, but maybe the purpose is so high that I hope that the media will not reduce the effectiveness of this webinar. So the topic of this webinar is quite clear. We are working in Africa. We are working for the development of renewables in Africa since many years. It's the fundamental reason why we do exist as a foundation, and why we have, let's say, founded many years ago this association. We want to stress what are the barriers, what are the hurdles that are affecting the transformation of an incredible potential, incredible resource, which is widely abundant in Africa, into real project, into real electricity available in a reliable, equitative, economical, and safe manner to all the population of Africa. So as I said, there are exceptions to this frustration. There are basically two, I would say. Then of course there are others, but the two most plastic, evidently, story of success are Morocco and South Africa. But if we put in the context of Africa, those two successes are basically drops in a sea, in the ocean, unfortunately. So the continuous transformation of Africa with the positive sustained economic and population growth, unfortunately with a very fast paced urbanization rate. I say unfortunately because urbanization rate in absence of reliable access to power, to water, sanitization, etc., creates slums in the surrounding, in the neighborhood of cities, probably worsening their living conditions rather than improving them. But this phenomenon altogether, it's leading to a pressure to act that is unprecedented, because we have millions and millions of young people that will be living in very close to the prosperity, to the modernity, probably with the negation of what we consider a human right, is this access to electricity. So we also agree, we also share, I think there is very little level of debate about this topic, that renewable energy is the cheapest source of electricity available today. So it's completely suitable for the multiple scheme of access to electricity, spanning from very rural, let's say frugal home systems, socket, a bulb, and a small module on the roof, to more, let's say, infrastructure form of development with utility scale project connected to the grid, where the grid is there. But in any case, the primary source of power, the cheaper primary source of power for Africa will inevitably be renewables. It's easier, cheaper, faster, and of course more sustainable, because let's remember that there is no point for any country around the world to establish a temperature increase containment program if there is another country, neighbor or not neighboring, which keep emitting CO2, because CO2 is a global problem. Anywhere we add CO2 in the atmosphere, we are frustrating the difficult efforts that other countries are doing to try to maintain them. But of course, CO2 Abatement, CO2 reductions cannot come under the, let's say, agreement, under the implication that Africans don't consume electricity. They have to consume electricity. They must. It's a human right. They need to have the access to power they want, the access to power they need, the access to power that is needed for education, healthcare, life in general. So the objective of this study is actually to understand why with such a massive flood of capitals deployed into renewables, why only a very minimal part. I would say if we exclude South Africa and Morocco, basically nothing happened. Basically nothing happened in Africa. And this is, I know, probably it's not a message that will be liked by many governments in Africa, but it's a reality. Face the reality, look the numbers, and see what happened. Nothing. Nothing. If you compare with the big game that was happening all around the world, including converging economies, including emerging economies, in Africa, basically there has been nothing. So the typical problem, the typical answer to this was I am in this field since 20 years and I've been developing projects in all around the world. So I think I have a field on my skin experience. So typically the answer was, there is no project, there are no money. Sorry, there is very difficult financial conditions, etc. Here, that's not that. The reason why, with a bunch of colleagues from the industry, from the financial institution, we have launched the Renew Africa program is exactly because we have understood, learned, walking the difficult pathway of many energy markets around the world, what are the real barriers. And so this, I'm happy that through this study, through this discussion, the hurdles will come very clear. Those are very clear to me and to us. Around those ideas and those reasons, we have built the concept of Renew Africa. Okay, so there is no lack of resources, there is no lack of money available, there is no lack of demand. Actually, the demand is frustrated by the lack of projects. There are two big problems. One is the project, let's say the project development side. So there are not enough good projects in Africa, and the other one, there is not a regulatory system in place to protect what are unavoidably long-term investments. So around these two concepts, I think the discussion today can be free and lively, because we don't want to create consensus. We want to stimulate discussion. It's much more fruitful. So let's discuss rather than agree, because it's more important to discuss to finally have some insightful conclusion in this webinar. So without much further ado, I think it's time to start the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kamisekera. And those points, of course, well noted. Demand is being affected by a lack of projects across the continent, and now's the time for us to act upon that. So I'd like to remind us all who are attending this particular webinar that you can ask questions in the chat box, and we will pick some of the questions that you have and refer them to the specific panelists to whom you are addressing them to. So please feel free to ask questions in case you have any. Now, I would like to get into this discussion. Would like to discuss more than agree, just like Engineer Antonio just mentioned. So what happened in the last 10 years? This is a conversation that we would all be interested in. And I would like to invite Luca Traini, who is the Senior Business Development and Partnership Officer at RES4Africa Foundation, to carry on this particular discussion.
Thank you, Joy, and good morning, everyone. Yes, this is a great opportunity for us, as Mr. Kamisekera said, to go back and look at what happened actually in the last 10 years and to discuss about real numbers and clearing a bit the ground from a lot of talk that has been done. And I would like to do that through the first part of showing the first part of this publication, which focused exactly on what happened in the last 10 years, or what somebody would say what didn't happen. So to do that, we have to clearly go and see what is the framework, the context of Africa as a continent and Africa as a continent of more than 50 countries. Africa is a continent in continuous transformation, and we have seen in the last 10 years growing in terms of population, and of course with a stable GDP growth. In this analysis, we also brought the comparison with 2 other regions we thought was fruitful for this discussion, with Latin America and India, and we can see there are similarities. But when we talk about GDP growth, actually, while at the Africa GDP growth was also possible thanks to the population growth, then India and Latin America did do even better, because their growth has bases that go beyond the sole growth of population. But when we talk about Africa and African countries, it's not just about that. As previously mentioned, is the urbanization, which is going fast and will be even faster in the next years and decades, with people moving to city, looking for better job opportunities, better services. But unfortunately, those services and opportunities will often not be there. Connectivity is another huge trend, with people getting more and more connected and using internet, both in sub-Saharan Africa and in North Africa. But we have to look also at the business environment, how it's transforming, and this revolution is often neglected. If we make a question to those who are following this webinar of how many, just don't look at the slide, how many big companies do you think are there in African countries? How many companies earning more than $1 billion in revenues per year, or $500 million? Then the usual answer will be just few, which is not true. So just imagine that more than 400 companies are earning revenue for more than $500 million, and 700 for more than $500 million. So means that the RES business are growing very fastly, even though we have also to consider that this is partially true also thanks to South Africa. We have also to acknowledge the fact there are a lot of small and medium enterprises giving jobs to more than 70% of employed people. But this transformation will not happen by itself. It needs a driver. So the government who will lead this transformation, and the government has the capacity to improve it, to make it better, to make it faster, or to make it slower. So we have to look at the quality of the governance and political stability, regulatory quality. And what we see is that African countries are not doing good. And even if we look at the last 10 years, there is no improvements. Just India did manage to improve in terms of quality of governance. But I do ask you to just keep in mind this slide, because we will use it later for our discussion. So let's go to our comfort zone and talking about energy. So the African market, as you can see, even though it is hosting 16% of the global population, just account for 6% of energy demand and 3% of electricity. And when we talk about energy demand, we have to acknowledge the fact that more than 50% goes to bioenergy, with all the issues related to charcoal use for cooking and for eating, and with all the environmental and healthy issues. But when we zoom and look at Africa, then we see also another picture, the fact that, let's say, 70% of those consumption are concentrated in North and South Africa, with little happening in sub-Saharan African countries. Let's say that this is also comparable with India, which has as well a limited consumption per capita. But who is needing this energy? So make it simple, people. And we have to see, and we see that in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of work done globally. So moving from 1.4 billion to 0.9 billion, where India reduced drastically their gap in terms of access to electricity, while sub-Saharan Africa did struggle to keep up with the population growth. And if we look at the difference between rural and urban areas, then we clearly see that a big part of this population lacking of access to electricity are living in rural areas. And here we have also to acknowledge that the estimation institutions have globally is the fact that those 600 million people without access to electricity will be there still in 10 years' time. But it's not just a matter of people lacking of electricity, there are also the issue of the economy. The firms are lacking of this electricity or the quality electricity. And this turns in terms of losses for those companies, which account for about 8% of their turnover, and for the countries in sub-Saharan Africa for about 2% of the GDP. So this is a huge impact. So the renewable energy has the potentiality to be the engine of this transformation, this growth. And this is actually what is already happening all around the world, where renewable energy are booming, and in the last 10 years actually doubled all around the world. But as already mentioned in our publication, just 2% was installed in Africa. So a lot of work has to be done. But again, we need to zoom to see what, because Africa is a huge continent with many, many countries. And of these 2%, 50% of the capacity installed is actually in North Africa and South Africa. So even less if we consider the many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is also mainly driven by large hydro, which is covering more than 70% of the capacity installed globally in Africa, which is about 48 gigawatt. And even if we consider just the last 10 years, then 40% is, which is the lion's share, goes to large hydro, which all the discussion going around large hydro and with the whole environmental impact and social impact. And this, unfortunately, is also with the huge potentiality that Africa as a continent has. Just two information that you don't find in this publication, in this slide, is the fact that Africa has two of the best spots for renewable energy. So when we talk about wind with the North Atlantic coast, and when we talk about solar with, of course, the Sahel, huge potentiality, actually untapped. But beyond talking about the all opportunities, and of course to be renewable energy fast to be deployed, environmental, and with all the benefits that coming along with renewables, we want to talk about how cheap, how convenient they got in the last 10 years. So just see the levelized cost of electricity, how for the solar, how it dropped during the last 10 years, reduction of 77%. Where actually auction were able to prove as one of the best procurement way to procure energy and to, of course, reduce the cost. Similarly, even better for onshore wind with even a lower cost and with a reduction of 35%. But here we need to bring back the discussion we opened before with the risk and the quality of governance. Because those risks then will be translated in the reality when we do implement projects. So risk will increase project financing costs, particularly in emerging markets where there are more risks. So at the end, risk will be transformed in higher cost of electricity for the country and for the final consumers. And this is particularly relevant for a continent in which the renewable energy investment for generation rely on 50% on foreign direct investment. So there is a need to de-risk and work for a better environment to attract investments. And you can see clearly also from this last slide, in which you can see that just South Africa, Morocco, and Egypt were able in the last 10 years to attract 60% of the investments. And to do that, they were able to put in place and adapt regulatory and supporting schemes to attract investment and increase the renewable energy penetration. I think I'm done with this, so I will give back the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca. That was quite insightful. And the fact that we need to de-risk, probably look into our frameworks as well and see if they are as attractive to allow for investment to happen across the continent. I'd like to bring in Jean-Peter, if he is here, to talk about the success story of Morocco as a wind energy investor. So would like to get into that conversation. Jean-Peter Cools is the Managing Director, Morocco, at Siemens Gamesa. If you can hear me, John, welcome.
Excuse me, Joy, Jean-Peter has some technical problem. Just give the word to Mathieu, and Jean-Peter will talk after.
All right, great. So Mathieu can now talk about what exactly has limited the renewable energy growth, because we have seen these limitations. If we're looking at 2% of addition of renewable energy across the African continent, and of this 2%, 50% is somewhere in North Africa, which is most likely Morocco and Egypt and Tunisia, and the rest of it is in South Africa. So what does this mean? What exactly are the limitations? Mathieu Ledepour, who is a computer intelligence, market studies and strategic analysis specialist at Enel Green Power, can now let us into this conversation. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you, Joy, and good morning, everyone. Can I have the presentation projected? Okay, thank you. So we presented together with my colleague Silvia Piana, head of regulatory affairs in Africa, particularly. We will. Okay. In this second chapter, we will focus on the main factors that prevent a bigger penetration of renewable energy in Africa, starting from the lack of political commitment and of an efficient regulatory framework in most countries, the issues of the power sector, the slow development of the productive uses of energy, and finally the financial risks. For each part of this chapter, we'll present and analyze the issues and present some best practice or a good example that could be taken into account to solve these problems. So, starting from the lack of commitment, if we look at the nearly 30 countries that set national renewable targets, we identified 8 of them with clear targets for 2020. And except for Mauritania, that which is target earlier, only Mali and Morocco hit the 50% mark with just 2 years to go. So that's bringing it to light that's there's a lack of, there's a need of a better target definition, but also a better management of planification and execution. Looking at the example of this table that show the auction with bidding, awarding dates and construction time, we can see that except for South Africa, there's often a non-insignificant gap between the scheduled date and the actual date. And in some cases, we have also seen that in some countries the auction have been cancelled. So one of the main reasons of these missing targets and this mismatching between planification and execution can be found in the lack of an effective regulatory framework. Microphone, Sylvia.
All right, thank you so much, Mathieu. I would like to bring Sylvia on as well to give us the best practices. So you could talk about the best practices and tell us where exactly we might be going wrong. Welcome, Sylvia.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you, everybody. My audio was muted. Okay, regulatory framework have advanced, but there's still a lot of room for improvements. And please mind the 4 countries highlighted in green, because we'll come back to them in a while. The slide doesn't move. Let's see. Mathieu, can you move the slide for me? Okay, thank you very much. Here you have a snapshot of some supporting schemes adopted. One of the most effective instruments is auctions, are competitive auctions. Some of them are implemented within the framework of international de-risking instruments, such as the scaling solar. Feed-in tariff, which is a remuneration scheme granted by governments and not awarded through competitive auction, are still used somewhere, but they are less and less utilized because in the long run they might prove to be difficult. They might prove to be a financial burden for governments. And coming back to the 4 countries that we saw the slide before, why they are the best in class, let's say. Well, they have something in common. All of them have a solid master plan for renewable energy development, which includes targets differentiated by technologies and also spread over time with specific milestones. Almost all of them already have or are in the process of implementing the possibility for commercial and industrial sector to have a direct contract with a private generator. These are commonly referred to as commercial or corporate or direct PPAs. And they are extremely important, particularly now in the COVID emergency, because commercial and industrial sector is at the heart of the economic recovery. So it is very important for this sector to have access to cheap, to reliable energy, to energy with a short time to market. That Mr. Kamisek already highlighted in this introduction. It's a common characteristic of renewable energy. Almost all of these countries also have an independent energy regulator, a partial unbundling of the power markets, and in all of them, auctions are the preferred procurement scheme.
Okay, so in the second chapter, we're going to analyze the issue of the power sector, starting from the transmission lines. That you can see that in Africa, there's a total length of almost 90,000 kilometers of transmission lines. That corresponds to more or less 3.3 meters per kilometer square on the continent. It's about 10 times less than in India and just above 1% of the global transmission line in the world. So the lack of these transmission lines give issues for the utilities, because it limits the access of new markets, and it also need more investment from the transmission system operator to improve his own national grid. And even in our integrated region as Western Africa, Eastern Africa, and Southern Africa, there's often still a low rate of power traded. The region with the highest share of power trade in total energy demand is Western Africa, and the share is just above 5%. The main obstacle of this power trading is once again the lack of transmission line, but that's often create congestion and isolate some country from the regional grid, but also the higher transaction cost that inhibit the transmission from country to another. So a fully integrated power market would have the potential to reduce both the congestion and reduce the cost of the electricity services. So let's have a look now to 2 of the best practice to improve the power grid.
Yes, here we'd like to present to you 2 best practice showing the critical role of transmission in supporting renewable energy development. The first one is Chile. You know the geography of Chile. It's a very long and very thin country in Latin America. And this geographical feature is the reason why it is served by 4 independent transmission systems. This independency, the lack of interconnection among this transmission system, cause grid congestions, curtailment, and very volatile prices, also unprofitable for renewable energy, because very often these prices drop dramatically during the hours of solar generation, the peak hours of solar generation. We are talking here about the Atacama Desert, which is in the northern region of Chile, which is one of the most endowed resources, solar resources in the world. And mind that the spread between the minimum and the maximum prices in some hours of the day was even $70 per megawatt hours. Then in 2017 and 2019, 2 new transmission lines connected the 2 main grids, and the effects of this interconnection was almost immediate. So prices converged, volatility reduced very, very much, as you can see in the graph on the left-hand side, right-hand side. Prices became profitable again, so they didn't go to zero. The spread of $70 I was mentioning before reduced to $11, and congestions reduced from 14% curtailment rate for wind and solar in 2017 to just 1% in 2019. More in general, when is transmission development successful? When there is, as in Chile is, and also in India, a transmission plan with a long-term view, updated often every year, and coordinated with generation. Now, the coordination among transmission and generation is really key, but it's not easy at all. It's very difficult. Also, when there is a vertically integrated utility because of different lead times. You know that for renewables, particularly for solar and wind, in 1-2 years, you can have a plant up and running. For transmission, you need 5 up to 10 years. So transmission must anticipate generation needs in a consistent way in order to avoid the risk of stranded assets. India is a great example because they have, the country has a very ambitious plan for renewable energy. The target is 175 gigawatts, gigawatts of renewable energy by 2022. And in order to support this plan, the National Electricity Plan, a 5+5 year plan for electricity development, is coordinated with transmission capacity. It is a fact that in the last few years, transmission capacity improved very much, both in terms of megawatts and of kilometers installed. You can see it from the graph that starts from 2013. 2013 was also the year where the national grid was connected with all states' grid in India, thanks to a program called One Nation, One Grid, One Frequency. And don't underestimate this, because India has more than 30 between states and territories to connect. So this was a great result, and it also a fact that last year, India got 100% electrified.
So in the next slide, we are gonna take a look at the other issue of the power grid. It's the high level of electricity losses, which is on the average in the continent is equal to 16%, but with a huge gap between north and south. The International Energy Agency estimated that the economical impact of these losses are on average 0.3% of the annual GDP of the continent. These issues on the grid are a challenge for the utilities and need important investment to be resolved. But unfortunately, most of the utilities can't afford such an investment. In sub-Saharan Africa, not even half of the utilities can cover their operating costs. The chronic deficits of the utilities is mainly due to the underpricing of the commodity, but there's also hidden costs like the losses of electricity, obviously, but also the bill collection losses and the overstaffing. On the overall, the International Energy Agency considered that in 2014, the utilities loss of revenues was around $21 billion, and these losses strongly impact the ability of the utilities to make investment in the necessary improvement of the grid. Focusing now more on the non-reflective tariff of electricity. On average, we can consider that the tariff of electricity in sub-Saharan Africa is $0.08 per kilowatt hour. But to cover all the costs of electricity, it should be 10 cents higher. And obviously, you can see from the graph that the situation is way different from the country to another. And there's really two particular exceptions, which is the Seychelles and Uganda, which is the only countries that are able to cover the capital costs and operating costs with the tariff of the electricity. In particularly in Uganda, from 2005, they implemented a series of reforms, starting from the unbundling of the own state utility, with setting up contract with performance indicators that include loss prediction targets and investment obligation, allowing the independent regulator to set cost-reflective tariff, introducing a rollout of prepayment of the bill and implementing a different mechanism of de-risking. So all this reform of the power sector allow to halve the losses from 38% in 2005 to 17% in 2018. And if you look at the graph on the right, you can clearly see that the more you have investment, the less you have losses. In the third part of this chapter, we'll talk about the productive use of energy. In the African continent, sorry, it's the continent with the lowest share of electricity in total energy consumption, and the residential sector represents more than 50%. And on the other hand, the productive share of energy consumption is just above 20%. And without considering South Africa and the northern country, this share is also below 20%. Furthermore, in South Africa, you have in South Africa you have a law of productivity, and the share of the agriculture is way more higher than the share of industry. And in this both sector, the productivity rate is one of the lowest in the world. And this clearly could be improved by a better access to reliable energy to improve productivity and support the economical development. But it's also true that developing the industry sector can create a more favorable environment for the penetration of renewable energy. This point is illustrated in these two examples, like in the rural sector in Tanzania. Sorry. Okay, in the rural sector in Tanzania, a small hydro plant integrated into a water, energy, food business model, provide electricity and water to a local population, improving the productivity of the farmer, but also the life condition of the population. And on the other side, in South Africa, in the more industrialized situation, solar factory needed a more reliable source of energy and installed solar panel on its rooftop that produce 18 gigawatt-hour a year. This investment increased the productivity by almost 10% and avoids the emission of 14,000 tons of CO2 a year. These two examples show that renewable energy can, yes, improve the productivity and the quality of life of the population with low access to electricity, but it's also true that it's a reliable and cheap source of energy for the industry, and the penetration of renewable energy can so be accelerated by a better development of this sector.
And now we come to the last part of this chapter, which is about risk perception. Investors still have a high risk perception of the business environment in the continent because they fear the lack of political stability, institutional stability, unfavorable macroeconomic conditions, and the lack of a clear and ready policy and regulatory framework. And this high risk perception is the reason why investment in renewables are still limited in Africa, despite the existence of great basic conditions, which are a growing and huge electricity demand and a huge potential for renewable energies. In order to reduce the perceived sovereign credit risk, efficient and comprehensive de-risking instruments must be implemented. This is absolutely key to stimulate the investors' appetite. According to the International Energy Agency, from now up to 2040, there is a need of investment in generation capacity that range from around $30 to $60 billion per year. And I have to say, there are already a lot of de-risking instruments. Sometimes we can say even too much, because they often are not coordinated and consistent among themselves. And in Chapter 3, Mr. Vigotti will give you a flavor of the right de-risking tools. But most of the existing instruments cover just some of the phases of the investment. In particular, an analysis carried on by RES4Africa on the EU de-risking instruments shows that most of them are focused on the preparation phases of the investment. So all the technical analysis, technical assistance, the pre-feasibility studies, and so on and so forth. Then there's the bidding phase and the tender process and the awarding phase. This phase is a bit neglected, allow me to say, because somehow it is assumed that this phase can proceed autonomously, which is not always the case. And then you have the final agreement, the financial closing, and hopefully the construction and operation of the plant. And here we want to conclude presenting 3 best practices of existing instruments, which have a lot of point of strengths, but also some limitation. One is the scaling solar and the GetFit. These 2 instruments are backed by international institutions, the scaling solar by the World Bank and the GetFit by the German Development Bank, KfW, as well as by other national authorities. This proved to be successful. The scaling solar was launched 5 years ago and has been launched in many countries in Africa, starting from Zambia, Ethiopia, Madagascar, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Togo. So far, it only delivered operating plants only in Zambia, but it is still progressing. Anyway, how it covers just the solar technology. The GetFit was successful in Uganda and Zambia, but it's also limited to small-scale projects. The REP stands for Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Process. It's a long acronym. It's a totally national instrument that, despite some slowdowns, some gems, I have to say it delivered quite successfully, at least so far, because now we have almost 4 gigawatts of solar and wind plants in operation. So that was all for this chapter. Thank you very much for your attention, and I leave the floor to you, Joy.
Thank you so much, Sylvia and Matteo. That was quite insightful as well. Legal frameworks, policy and legal and rather regulatory frameworks need to be put in place. The challenge of cancelling of auctions, I don't know how this is going to be fixed, because we're seeing this a lot in many African countries as well, where they commit and then months later or 2 years later, they cancel this commitment. How would you recommend that this be fixed? If I might pose this question to Matteo and Sylvia.
Can you repeat the question, please? Sorry, I didn't hear you well, sorry.
We have seen a lot of cancellation on auctions or cancellation of auctions. How do we fix this? Because there's an issue of commitment from African countries. How do we fix this, or how do you recommend this be fixed?
Yeah, it's, we briefly talk about that in the beginning, that there's a lack of proper coordination between planification and execution, and there's some auction have been cancelled afterwards, after the awarding of the auction, and that could be fixed. One of the main problem of that is a proper and efficient regulatory framework that can cover all the phases of the auction, and allow for the investors to have a clear view on how the things are going on, and also a political commitment from the African government that let me say that do what they say. If you define a regulatory, clear regulatory framework, you should to reassure the investors, you have to define what the regulatory framework and give the process have to go the long way of like it's been defined from the beginning. It's a combination of rules and political commitments.
And
Right.
let me add that a dialogue, continuous dialogue with this, with institution, it's absolutely key to reach results. And it's under this perspective, RES4Africa Foundation is doing a great job, because really the important thing, as also Mattia was saying, is not to focus on specific moments, specific phases, but to keep and to cultivate the relationship, the technical assistance through all the phases, since the very, very beginning to the moment where the plant is already operating.
All right, thank you so much. And now would like to hear a success story from Morocco, a wind energy success story. And this one is going to be presented by Jean-Peter Coles, who is the Managing Director at Morocco. You can hear me,
yes.
Welcome.
Yes, I hope. Yes, I hope you can hear me, because I have some connection problems, but I can hear you very well.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yes, so Morocco is a bit of an atypical case in the context that we discussed today, because the take-up in Morocco was indeed quite successful over the last, let's say, 10 years in both solar and wind energy. So I would quickly reflect upon the factors that make this happen. I would maybe give quickly the inevitable data on the company I'm working for. So work for Siemens Gamesa, and it's the fruit of a merger between Siemens Wind Power and the Spanish company Gamesa. So we have over 100 gigawatts installed now globally among both of us, and we have more than 24,000 employees. So we have annual revenues of over 10 billion, and we have an order backlog which is more than double than that. So we experience a quite healthy demand. What we try to do is to incorporate as much intelligence in the turbines as possible to make them as productive as possible also. Yes, can you move? Because I cannot move. Yes, thank you. So Africa was for us, both of us, for both legacy Siemens, legacy Gamesa, was a focus of interest. So we took quite early positions in the north of Africa, in particular Morocco, also Tunisia and Egypt, and also then rather Siemens Wind Power in the south with South Africa. And in the three core countries where demand is rather concentrated, Morocco, Egypt, and South Africa, we approach now close to 1 gigawatt of installed wind power. I'm talking about wind power in particular, because this is the core business of Siemens Gamesa. Yes. Yes, so Morocco, indeed, we were early developers, and we started out in the north, strong winds but turbulent, and then went down to the south. So both let's say in the big ONE, so the public utility programs, but also the private, the IPP segment. And so we have in the meantime installed now close to 1 gigawatt as said, because part of the 480 megawatt that we are building currently is being installed. And we have quite some employees. We have almost 800 employees in Morocco, and this is because of the fact that it's part of our strategy to localize, so to build some components locally. This in the next slide, we see a picture of our blade factory in Tanger. Blade factory in Tanger that we built by the end of 2017 was part of our localization commitment for the big program, 850 megawatt ONE program, and that gives work to 750 employees. So the capacity conceived is more than 600 blades per year. So let's move then to the specific Moroccan factors for quick uptake. Why was Morocco successful? So first of all, this is still illustrating how concentrated the prospect in Africa for renewables is in wind power. This is wind power. And we see that there is 3 big markets standing out. So there is, first of all, South Africa, very strong market prospection, or prospect better. There is Egypt, which was an early uptaker and is consolidating. And there is Morocco in the 3rd place. And of course, the 3 together take up far more than half of the installed wind capacity in Africa until the year 2027 to 2028. And on the right side, you see that this goes in pair with very important decreases in generation cost. So the sheer scale of installation and, let's say, the virtuous circle of these dynamics is driven by, it's a virtuous circle actually. So you drive the generation cost down, you avoid, of course, subsidies, and you get in the end also some dynamic running that sparks your growth of renewable energy. Yes, the next one. So Morocco, let's say, Morocco in economic terms and in consumption, electricity consumption rate per head is just an average country. It's not one of the big economies. It's not one of the big consumers of electricity. Morocco has achieved electrification, rural electrification. Everybody has access to electricity in Morocco at the moment. And there was, and this is very particular, a clear voluntary strategy by the government at all instances, in fact, by the King of Morocco, a clear target setting. We want 42 renewables in terms of installed capacity by 2020. We want more than 52% renewables by 2030. And this was put in place in 2 ways. So by large scale public-private programs that were focusing on first reducing the generation costs, so make electricity affordable. So the contrary of subsidizing, no, deliberately driving down the cost of electricity for the end users, and also very much reduce the dependency on imported energy, imported electricity, imported fossil resources, because Morocco has no, let's say, fossil resources and is therefore dependent on imports, which is a weight on the trade balance and on the financial equilibrium. Morocco also wanted very early on an industrial leg, an industrial strategy. They want to create this as, let's say, a driver for industrial growth. And now recently also looking at new value applications beyond electricity, so making let's say, electricity or renewable electricity generate new value applications in the form of hydrogen, which is not really the subject of today. Yes? So what did Morocco well? So first of all, I think it's very important to realize that in Morocco, the abundance of the sheer abundance of the resource. So wind capacity factors in the south are extremely high. So we have wind speed that are smooth and up 9 to 10 meters per second. So capacity factors in some areas over 50 to 60%, coming close to base load. And also Morocco managed very well to drive capex down. Again, big projects, mega project tendering, clear target setting, so a clear pipeline definition, and this has enhanced very much competition. This has created economies of scale, and this has also enabled localization that is cost effective, that contributes to cost benefits. Also, Morocco was very skillful at managing the cost of debt, which is another driver of generation cost, of course, with PPAs that are indexed to hard currency, so no currency risk, backed by a government guarantee, but in general, and as is well known, a stable macroeconomic and political environment that is reinforcing very much the investor confidence. So there was a good complementarity and interplay between the big multilateral financial institutions and also available domestic financing capacity. Yes. So what is the result? So we see that by now, indeed, the targets in terms of installed capacity are met. So we have solar coming first, concentrated solar in particular, evolving towards photovoltaic. We have wind, which is by now over 15%, so solar 16%, and hydro, which has reached the limit of its capacity in combination with pumped storage, pumped hydro, also amounting to 15%. So we are really on target with respect to the 42%. We overshoot 42% in terms of capacity. Of course, if we look at production, we need to take into account the load factors, and we see that coal is still the dominant source. Look in production terms, 72%. Yes, so when we look then towards 2030, we see the very ambitious target of 52% seems to be on track. However, Morocco is going to need changes. Morocco is implementing changes in the regulatory framework, providing more flexible access for private developers. There are grid stability issues, and this is somehow making the business case for private developers a bit more difficult, because these costs have to be externalized, they have to be carried by someone, and of course the private developers are bearing a big share of it. What will be needed to reach the targets are new large-scale public-private projects. This is the advantage of Morocco, the availability of land in the south, especially to build big wind farms. The grid will need reinforcement because the distance from the wind sites to the off-takers are more than 1,500 kilometers, and large-scale storage mechanisms in the form of pumped storage are envisaged. And by 2030, we see that coal becomes also, in production terms, that coal becomes minority, and that the most of the production will come from renewables with some aspect of gas that needed to stabilize the grid. Yes, final one. Yes. Yes. So let's say Morocco has been successful because of these factors. These dynamics are somehow running towards saturation in some terms. So we see that the high voltage industrial demand, local industrial demand, is relatively saturated by now. We see that energy efficiency programs also reduce the growth of demand. We see that the country is fully electrified. So on the demand side, there is something that would, let's say, give way to export. However, export, so the generation costs are very competitive in Morocco, but this is compensated by the transport costs to bring this over 2,000 kilometers from the south to the European mainland. So there is also the fact, which was mentioned, that the renewables grow fast in the electricity mix. However, the primary energy consumption remains very much based on fossil energy. So with the oil import and the electrification of the electricity in the total energy demand remains relatively low. So there is work to do. And there is also on the supply side, grid stability issues, intermittency. We have talked about that. The fact that the sites are remote from off-takers. And this is driving Morocco to new value applications in the form of hydrogen, in the form, the link with drinking water, with desalination. But hydrogen seems to be particularly interesting to overcome these limitations, this saturation, this electricity transport problems in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I just have a question for you. You did mention earlier in the presentation that Morocco does not have fossil resources, and so they are heavily dependent on imports. Does that explain partly why this was a success story, and also putting it across the continent, many of the African countries are heavily dependent on fossil fuels? So would this also partly explain the success story for Morocco?
Yeah, absolutely. So the fact that this energy dependency from the start was signaled out as a priority problem, and the stimulation of renewable energies was indeed specifically focused at reducing this dependency. It's not only, let's say, just the sheer costs and the fact that the currency and so the trade balance and the currency implications, but also the fluctuations. So the fact that those commodities or these fossil resources, the sharp fluctuations on the world markets make this desirable to ease the dependency.
All right. And a second question to you is, Sylvia mentioned that sometimes it takes about 2 years to set up and 5 to 10 years for transmission to finally happen. How long did it take in Morocco's case?
Yes, in Morocco it took indeed a while, because these large-scale programs they require very close consultation and consensus building between the stakeholders inside the country, and also to harness, let's say, the financing with the DFIs. So what Morocco did quite well was to early on engage with all those stakeholders and carefully assess the pros and cons of approaches, and then launched something that was from the start perceived as feasible, as realistic, and as said, has had the support, so was coherent, had the support of all the stakeholders after consultation, and also, of course, importantly, had the support, therefore, also from the big multilateral institutions and credit providers.
All right, great. Thank you so much. We do appreciate those responses. I would now like for us to invite Amit Singh, who is the co-head Energy Finance at Nedbank, is going to talk to us about the auction programs and give us a South African success story to deliver renewable energy at scale. And knowing that also renewable energy, ladies and gentlemen, is part of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations 2030 agenda. And so us having this edition on the African continent is an added advantage to helping us deliver on this agenda as well. So Amit Singh, welcome. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Good day, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts on this very important and great success story from South Africa. Being the last speaker, I see that we're running way behind the schedule, almost 20 minutes. So I'm not too sure if I should make up the time, but let's see how it goes, Joe. Thank you. Yeah, so, I think the South African renewable energy program is well documented, and people have been following it in the sector for the last 10, 15 years. just because to understand how and the elements that led to being successful. And for us as a banking sector, one of the important parts that contributed to the success was the ability for the South African government, who had still good credit ratings, to underwrite the payment obligations from the utility or the buyer. So that was quite critical. The other big thing for us, what we found, that the procurement program was quite fair, where they set up independent office to manage the procurement and the tendering process. So the rules were clear, the regulatory framework was well established, and having this independent office to almost see through this program, we did not see any objections or court cases about procurement. So that's generally a big problem in the continent, but I think we managed that risk very well, and to date that's really been useful. You know, it's interesting to know that this program initially started as a feed-in tariff program, but after the government looked at the regulatory framework and all the consultations, it turned out to be an auction or a bidding scheme where you do these things. The whole program was well established, and with those fundamental points, we were able to attract South Africa extremely experienced developers and sponsors to start preparing these projects for the bids. And with that in mind, that gave the banks the confidence to really underwrite and bank these transactions in a way that to make it really the scale that it is. You know, government, if we all know South Africa, we are still a very coal-based power sector, with majority of our power being generated by fossil fuels, coal, primarily coal. So government was also asked to really look at diversifying this due to the commitments to the Paris Treaty and also to the world to clean up the environment. So that was also a big challenge. But if you understand the context of South Africa, job creation, social upliftment, and economic transformation is also very big agendas within the country. Considering our past, where we come from, government has spent significant amount of the energy budgets on rural electrification. Remember, a very small percentage of the population had access to electricity. As Mr. Enel said, that it's a human right for us all to have power. And in South Africa, historically, it was not the situation due to the social and the political framework that we had. But post our democracy, I think government has done well. But then we've caught up with other challenges where the grid was just not had not have enough power to anticipate the demand, and we had load shedding and the utility, the maintenance schedules, and two big power plants did not come online and a schedule. So we had huge national blackouts, and that also contributed to this whole electricity growth of renewables and independent power producer market in South Africa. So I just need to go on to the next slide. Some results. Can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. So considering this, and I think many of our colleagues in the reports have used South Africa as an excellent case study, and what this program has done to South Africa. And it's been great in terms of showing the world that such a program at the scale it can be delivered in the tip of Africa, and we can set a good precedent for the rest of the continent to use to replicate and do these programs. Although it was a great success, it's still not enough in our mind, and more can be done. And I think government has been proceeding very cautiously on rolling out more bidding rounds and more auctions for the same reason. But I think the time has come now where we have no option, just purely because of the shortage of generation grid, that we have to accelerate these programs. But interestingly, as a thought leadership and as a collective, as for RES4Africa, we must also understand why government generally have been stalling or not accelerating more procurement and more auctions in this program. You know, South Africa has a huge unemployment problem that has been there. We have huge social economic imperatives of creating black industrialists, local black industrialists. We have a huge imperative to ensure that we create localization or manufacturing capacity within the country. And lastly, we have an imperative to ensure that the power comes at a price into the grid where it's competitive and it's really benefit to the consumer to help South Africa prosper. So all these things put in mind, and if we want to see more renewables being projected into the economy and more bidding rounds come, we have to start thinking on those lines and how we can help government in this space. So can I move on to the next slide, please? Some reasons. Yeah, thank you. And I think I would like to spend some of the time that I have allocated with some of these current challenges, which I've started.
No worries.
You know, renewables is great for the world. Sorry?
You have ample time, so don't be in a hurry.
Okay, great, thanks. So, yeah, so you can understand the current challenges that we have, why government has really not continued at the scale where we thought we can roll out more programs and more megawatts into the grid. We all know that many developers have bid-ready projects where they've permitted it, they've done the yield studies, and it's ready to be bid into the program. And we see the tariffs coming down over the years. So we know that it can be very attractive to government and the economy and our regulator, that these things are very attractive, but still we had huge procurements. And one of the few things that I've noted in the next slide is the current challenges that we see that which should be unpacked and should be the focus area of our thinking and understanding how to help government promote and accelerate further procurement. You know, as we being a coal sector, we have a huge coal sector, a lot of coal mines, and our majority of our power generated from our coal fleet. So, you know, when the renewables first came up, due to political and labor challenges, it has been seen and perceived to be a huge threat to coal jobs. And how do we address that, and how do we really ensure that everyone is taken along this journey of the renewable and energy transition? If we just keep promoting renewables, it will definitely delay the process. You know, it even reached a stage where the coal lobby groups took the government to court to stall some of the programs and the bidding rounds. So they are very worried about this. It's a huge job created, the coal sector, and how can renewables really complement or add to the jobs, and rather than working out and reducing the jobs in this energy sector. So that is there. And we all know that renewables, the job per megawatt is a very low number. So to help build the jobs and narrative and story, it will be very important for us to spend some time in energy to show to government that the long-term benefit of the cheap, quick renewables is a job creator rather than a job taker, due to the greater economic benefit in the value chain of the economy, rather than just looking at the actual power plant creating jobs. You know, cheap power allows more efficient manufacturing, more efficient mining, more efficient processes, and that's the real benefit which can be delivered through renewables, rather than just narrowly looking at you're losing 1,000 jobs in a coal power station and you're only supplementing with 20 in a wind farm. So I think that narrative and that story will be important for the RES4Africa and the whole sector to start looking at the whole value chain of the jobs story. Then we have a very our national grid infrastructure, both the transmission and distribution, is rather old, and money has not been spent over the years. And our operator of the grid is we still have one entity called Eskom that operates the grid and also generates the majority of the power. So you can see they have huge financial constraints in really developing proper, stronger grid infrastructure. We have huge transmission losses in our coasts. I think that was also a theme from Sylvia's slides previously. So we have those problems. And how do we support government in really stabilizing the grid, creating smart grid cities where people can dispatch power, net power back into the grid, like we've seen in some European countries like Germany? How do we really help government to really overcome this challenge? Currently, for example, if you have to bid a program, a project into the bidding rounds, you need a grid letter from the Eskom that they can connect you, and they'll give you a price that should be connected. There's a deep cost and a shallow cost, and it's kind of shared a bit. But currently Eskom really, I don't think they're in the position to invest in new substations or substation upgrades. So at some stage, if the grid network can also be part of a private sector, where the private sector is allowed to contribute to strengthening the grids and helping the national utility to partner with them and see how to make it facilitate more renewables into the grid. For example, we saw how our grid was exposed recently during the COVID crisis, where our demand was very low and some of the wind projects were causing some grid instability, and we had to almost curtail for a few hours in the day some of the projects. But I think that problem was quickly overcome, because as demand picked up, we were short of power in the grid. But it exposed that the grid is a problem and we really need to do that. Then the other problem is, if we use Eskom as a case study, and if everyone's going to use renewables, will Eskom be the big battery for this grid? And how will they charge, or how will they pay, or for just being on standby to supply power when the wind does not blow or the sun does not shine? And we see the value of dispatchable energy to the South African grid is quite important now. And we will see that in the next bidding round, where we plan to launch a emergency procurement, a short-term procurement program, and dispatchable power will be a key element to that. The role of batteries, and what does even batteries do to tariffs. So that will be very interesting, and we will see how the big developers and the sector reaches out to that part of the. Then, you know, we had in the early rounds, when the procurement first started, the tariffs were quite high, because generally the kits and the EPC prices were very high and renewables were still not very competitive. But the government launched a program, and in spite just to prove that it's doable, and the tariffs are really high. So currently there's a perception that they should reduce the tariffs of the earlier bidding rounds, and how to do it. And there's some proper engagement process with government and the developers to make that work, you know, refinancing and all the other things. But that's also created a bit of a sour taste in some angles of society and government for the renewables. Yeah, and the last point I would say that, you know, with our current buyer and Eskom sitting in the financial position they are, the more private sector gets involved in terms of the embedded generation, the captive generation, which Sylvia also mentioned previously, and I think my colleague on the Ethiopia case study spoke about, is a huge grid defection. And all good paying customers will eventually leave Eskom because of the increased tariffs and security to secure their own security of power. And how does that fit in the bigger economic fiscus? And that is definitely going to be a challenge which all role players will have to watch out and see how it's best managed. Okay. So I'll just move on to the next slide, please. Yeah. So the future of renewables in South Africa, as you said, we expect a short-term procurement program to be launched soon. We see a lot of mines and big industrial companies launching their own renewable energy programs, and government has opened up that sector. So as I spoke about the defection from good paying customers and how that really affects the fiscus and Eskom's income statement. The municipal power program. So we saw that there's some draft legislation to allow municipalities to buy directly from IPPs. So currently the sector structure is that only Eskom is a buyer from all IPPs, but if municipalities buy and launch their own programs, that's a huge opportunity for sponsors and developers to get involved and work through the municipalities. We have some bankable municipalities in terms of credit risk. The round 5, we expect next year, another bidding round, a very big bidding round. And the last thing is rooftop embedded generation. We, as Nedbank, has funded quite a few portfolio structures where that's also taking up very nicely. And all the clients have seen the huge value of rolling out solar PV on their rooftops and that space. I think I will end there now. It's 2 more minutes for the seminar and leave some time for some questions. Joy, is that okay?
Yes, that's fine. You did mention somewhere in your presentation that what happens, you know, when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine out. Let's talk about storage. Maybe some other countries across Africa can learn some lessons from South Africa. Tell us about the storage capacity for South Africa's renewable energy facilities.
Yeah, so currently Eskom on the peaking side, we have peaking power stations and we have pump storage that helps us with our storage. there's plans to develop a gas program to bring some mid-merit power into the station, and that will also help balance on the renewables, but that hasn't been rolled out, and I think it has to come quickly. And in order for renewables to grow, the storage sector has to be growing in tangent with in complement the renewable program. As I said, the value of dispatchable power is becoming very important to our grid. So storage is there, but we know batteries are expensive, and it's going to be a price for the storage to put and manage these things. So we see in the emergency procurement some storage, lots of storage being bid by developers, and the tariffs the jury on the tariffs is still out there. So, but we think that gas is a very good complementary to renewables, and it's cleaner than the coal. So renewables to prosper, gas has to also prosper alongside that.
Great, thank you so much, Amit Singh. Amit Singh is the co-head energy finance at Netbank, the first member partner of RES4Africa from the African continent. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to bring on Roberto Vigotti, the Secretary General of RES4Africa Foundation, to give us some action points where we need to act on now. Mr. Roberto, welcome.
Thank you so much, Joy. Thank you to all the speakers, and congratulations for the input you gave. As you know, already you received the book by PDF from the registration, and in the next few days, we will put on the website also the presentation. Please use them, disseminate them for the benefit of the others. It's very difficult to sum up. I'll go very quickly. You saw the book is in 3 chapters. What happened? What limited the growth? The time is act now. Let me concentrate quickly so you can stay with us a few more minutes. Next slide shows, of course, a summary. In blue on the right, the good points, the factor which stimulates deployment of energy. On the left, the negative factor we have to overcome, and many speakers today touched that one. Next one shows also why only 2%. All those factors have been discussed, and I think our study gives you facts. We're really keen to give you facts. So now quickly, because time is over, but I think you can go back to this slide. The time to act is now. And there are 4 main recommendations I want to give you. And now slowly, first one. The first one is foster electricity market openness, attractiveness, and readiness. Next slide shows you a summary of our study. We are doing this study with UNECA, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Madame Verasong is our partner. And we analyze, at least for the first 15 countries, the openness, attractiveness, and readiness of the regulatory system to deploy renewables. So we are going to have a webinar most likely in the fall with the first results. Joy, you are booked again for giving you how the single countries are comparably open and attractive for making things happen. And you have the details of the what are the topics we are going to discuss. Next slide also. Stimulate integrated power transmission and create regional energy market. We discuss it even now with South Africa and Morocco, and definitely we need to take consideration in the same amount, not only renewable sources, but also transmission and distribution. It's like when you talk about cars, Alfa Romeo versus Audi, and you don't talk about freeways and roads. They're equally important. It's important we do allow also private sector to invest in transmission distribution, because as we heard now from Netbank, it is difficult, the utility in place today, they can put money aside to invest in the network. So this is also very important. You can read also the details of our recommendation here. The third recommendation is, next slide, is the productive use of energy in top of the agenda. After all, what we're talking about is to allow the people at the end of the line to make growth, to develop economic consistency, to increase the quality of their life. So I think we need to consider how this energy which we produce, hopefully in a clean way, and we transmit in an efficient way, go to the final user, not only to the household, but also most important to small, medium, large enterprise, so that they can really increase the quality of their products. And it's also important that these recommendations are taken into account in their master plan. And the final one, my recommendation is, the next slide, is to develop a comprehensive de-risking instrument to unlock Africa potential. We have seen before in the presentation that so far we have too many fragmented and not all of them efficient program to assist Africa, especially in Europe. I think those have to be remodulated to make ambition much higher. And then again, in all those areas, we need to be supported by the investment guarantee program that we are developing. In fact, Joy, let me conclude with the next slide. I think is just a phrase. Yeah, looking back to the past to face the present, very nice. But I want to show you the last slide, which I added now, which is the marketing for the next webinar, which we think I have. And Joy, you can also again reiterate 15th of July.
Right.
Can you mention this one, Joy?
Yes. Thank you very much, Roberto. The final or the third, let me call it the third because it might not be the final. The third webinar is going to be about scaling up renewable energy investments in Africa and the need for a new support program and the case for Renew Africa. Of course, you can also find more of this webinar and the previous webinars conversations on the RES4Africa website. So go to res4africa.org and you'll be able to download all of them, including today's publication that you will find on there regarding why only 2% of renewable energy addition has happened in Africa in the last decade, and the action points as well that you will see on there, as well as the best practices. So we're going to have the next one on the 15th of July, 2020, which is also going to be a Wednesday. And I would like for you all to participate in that one as well, because it's important for us to understand the need for a new support program and the case for Renew Africa to scale up the renewable energy investments across the continent. So thank you all so much to the panelists, to everyone who has attended, all 230 of you who have participated in this conversation today. Much, much appreciated. And I believe we've come to the end of today's webinar, and until the next one, thank you all so much, and let's keep the conversation going.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.